university professor at University of Arizona. She's won, countless awards, distinguished service to the NSF, to the university, teaching awards, the usual accolades that we expect and honor. But what is really important for us as the ASN is how much of a consummate community member she's been for us. She's served on the council for years in the role of secretary, now as president. ASN's president role carries on for a total of like 5 or 6 years when you count all the elects and past. And that's our institutional memory. And probably her most important service to us is that she was the EIC, the editor-in-chief for AMNAT, where she, during which time she really established the kind of brand that we think of for AMNAT of being a really rigorous and difficult review process, but one that's also kind and constructive and makes everybody's science better. And I've been an AE for a long time. I've worked with a couple of editors. Judie was an incredible editor that really pushed the journal forward in important ways. A little bit quickly about her science. I don't want to take her time. She has studied aspects of mutualism from the theory perspective, from the experimental perspective, field work. She really embodies this thing that we think of at ASN as the conceptual unification of an idea. And when I started getting interested in coevolution as a topic years ago, which was not very many after she did, I'm reading the literature and there's all this mutualism stuff from Judie. I didn't realize until much later that hadn't really been a thing until Judie came along, right? So her impact was so strong on the idea of mutualism that it was not a idea, 5 or 6 years down the line. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. She's a great speaker, and she's going to give awards first, and then she'll have her talk. So please welcome Judie Bronstein.
Wow. That's so nice. It's such an honor to be here for the ASN, my favorite society of all times, and to have models of colleagues like Butch, not only scientific, but leading this society. It's just been very exciting. And welcome everyone to the meeting. And we're here, right? It's like we are here in 3 dimensions. And that makes me feel so lucky. Butch had to do this virtually last year in front of a beautiful fire, yes, but I would much rather be here in this beautiful venue talking to you. So every year, a great deal of effort is invested by all the societies, including ASN, in choosing winners of our leading awards for the society. The hard work is mostly done by a series of committees of your peers that are, selected to represent a variety of levels of seniority, diversity, fields of scholarship. And they do hard work, they make wonderful choices, and I'm very appreciative of them. And I also very strongly encourage everyone to nominate your colleagues for these awards. That's the best way that the society can recognize the full breadth and diversity of what we have, is to get fabulous nominations from all of you, and thank you in advance for that. So the first award I'd like to present is the ASN Award for Distinguished Achievement in the Conceptual Unification of the Biological Sciences. And I'd like to invite our winner, Laurent Keller, to start moving up here. This award honors the memory and legacy of Sewell Wright, a consummate practitioner of the kind of science that the ASN values the most. And Laurent of the University of Lausanne is just an exemplary choice for this award. The award is recognizing his distinguished record integrating ecology, evolution, genetics, and behavior, the full 9 yards, to understand fundamental questions about sociality and ants, and more broadly, to really understand in a very deep way the balance of conflict and cooperation, an issue that's very close to my own heart, and I've learned so much from what Laurent has done. In his work, alone and with colleagues, over 350 papers, I believe, I think he shows us that it's possible to both go very deep and very broad at the same time, while staying really true to the biology of one's group of organisms. So I'd like to congratulate Laurent and present you with the plaque, and congratulations so much, very well deserved. The next award is the ASN Distinguished Naturalist Award. This was established to honor the retirement of Professor E.O. Wilson, and it recognizes an active mid-career researcher who is making significant contributions to understanding a particular system or group of organisms. In the ASN, we value organismal biology and natural history to the level that we make this one of the major awards of the year. This year, the award went to Tadashi Fukami of Stanford University, and Tad, please come up. I think this is a wonderful choice. In recognition of Tad's groundbreaking research on the ecological and evolutionary dynamics of community assembly that's really very deeply infused with the natural history of a system. Tad's worked on a variety of systems in his career, but most recently, in recent years, he's been working on nectar microbiome communities. So he's looking at the dynamics, ecological, evolutionary, priority effects communities in the microbes that are found in nectars, and then looking at how these micro interactions scale up to the macro scale for things like plant pollinator interactions. So it's a wonderful demonstration how having your questions emerge from a deep understanding of your study system can take you to a whole new level in understanding and then be integrating across systems. Classic ASN work. Wonderful choice of that committee, and Tad, congratulations, and also for your recent service to the ASN. Thank you. The ASN Presidential Award is the one that I get to choose. And it's the best thing about being president. It's also the hardest thing about being president, because it's an award that recognizes the paper in American Naturalist in the preceding year that spoke the most to you, right? So it can be a very personal thing. And oh, I have not been advancing the slides. My apologies. The choice I made this year is to Jessica Clark, Luke McNally, and Tom Little for a paper called Pathogen Dynamics Across the Diversity of Aging. It's very integrative in a way that's just classic AmNat and ASN. It integrates organismal biology, life history theory, demography, epidemiology via both theoretical and empirical studies. Again, it's the whole thing. It's looking at model systems of Daphnia. And it's providing really interesting insights into disease spread and containment in a model system. And these are topics that, for some reason, are of great interest to all of us right now. Beyond that, it's also about the evolution of aging, which is particularly interesting, at least to some of us in this room right now. So in absentia, let's congratulate Jessica and her colleagues. The American Naturalist Student Paper Award is chosen by the editors of the journal. This is a very hard job, because not only are there a lot of papers in AmNat every year, but about a third of them are by students and with student first authors. And they're an absolutely mind-blowing group of papers. It's a very hard job to choose one that they feel should be the winner. This year, we're giving the award to Paul Bendix Wahlberg, and come on up, Paul, for warming rates alter sequence of disassembly in experimental communities, published with Edwin Green. In this paper, they present an experimental test of a fascinating and novel question, which is, does the rate of warming, not the extent of warming, but the rate of warming, change the order in which species are lost from communities? So it's a great example of experimental ecology that has a really strong conceptual foundation and is directed at a problem of increasing and timely interest in the world today. And I'd like to congratulate Paul for a truly splendid piece of work. Thank you. Yes. And I'd also like to recognize that we had 2 honorable mentions this year. These are hard choices, and some years we just have to recognize a few more people. And so we'd like to recognize Cora Klein of the University of Zurich and Ken Thompson, who I believe is here. And Ken, if you want to just stand up. Yeah, great job. And Ken was a winner last year, actually, of the next award I have to present, which is the ASN Early Career Investigator Award. This recognizes outstanding and promising bodies of work by our younger investigators in the field. And this award honors the memory of Jasper Loftus-Hills, a young, outstanding biologist who died much too young. This year's recipients, of course, are giving their talks in a special symposium on Tuesday. And at that point, I'll introduce them individually and give them their awards. But I do want to name them. They're Pavitra Muraldhar from UC Davis, Kim Wang of University of Oxford, Chuliang Song of McGill University, Rachel Moran of University of Chicago, and Melissa Guzman of USC. And we strongly encourage you to attend the very exciting symposium on Tuesday where they'll present their work. So let's give them all a hand. So the Joint Society presents an award, as you know. It's the Inclusiveness, Diversity, Equity, and Access, or IDEA Award. It's a Joint Society award given to recognize people or a group at any career stage who's strengthening our community by promoting inclusiveness and diversity in our field. This year, it was given to a group called Diversity of Nature and its co-founders, 2 graduate students, Melissa Massey and Sushinta Arif, PhD candidates at Dalhousie University in Canada, in recognition of their efforts to develop national and local diversity-based programming that engage BIPOC students at multiple educational stages in evolution and ecology. And we congratulate them. In addition, let me say that last year's IDEA Award winner, Adriana Briscoe, will be presenting a keynote address on Tuesday. And I encourage everyone to attend that. I was just given a piece of paper that has the names of the winners of the poster competition from last night. So I don't have a slide, but I can announce the winners of the ASN Outstanding Student Paper Award. And if you happen to be here, by all means stand up so we can cheer for you. The winner is Jay Gallagher, University of Denver. And there are 2 honorable mentions. Carly Bautista of the University of Laval in Quebec. Congratulations. And Cade Hirabavashi of the University of Victoria, BC. The Canadians cleaned up this year. Congratulations. Okay, and finally, this year the ASN decided to give an award it had never given before. It wanted to give a special commendation entitled the ASN Presidential Award for Outstanding Service to the Community. And we're giving it to Todd Vision of the University of North Carolina in recognition of his leading role in the creation of the Dryad digital repository. As the result of the work of Todd and his colleagues, it's now the norm for the foundational products of our science, right, the data, to be archived for later examination and use by other scientists. This is a huge achievement, and it seemed only appropriate to have created a special award for its creators. So in absentia, let's give Todd a giant and rousing thanks. Great. And finally, let me encourage all members to attend the business meeting, which we'll have at 1:30 today in one of the smaller rooms. The ASN has a lot to report about what's gone on this year. We want to tell you about new DEI initiatives. We want to tell you about new things we have going on with the Graduate Council, and we want to solicit some input from you about the future of virtual meetings. It's our opportunity as a leadership to hear from the community, and we really, really hope you'll attend. We can't promise you food, but we're a fun group of people, and we greatly look forward to seeing you. We also look forward to seeing you in January. We're back on for a standalone ASN meeting, and we hope to see many or all of you at Asilomar, and stay tuned about the details of that meeting. Okay. With that said, that is the end of the awards part of this plenary, and now I have the very daunting task. That was the fun part. The daunting part is, oh my God, I now have to give a plenary address to the society that means the most to me. And let me start by saying this. I have been a member of the ASN since I was 19 years old, which sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. When I was a sophomore in college at Brown, I pulled down an issue of the American Naturalist from the shelf, and I saw this paper called "Why Fruits Rot, Meat Spoils, Seeds Mold and Meat Spoils" by somebody that I didn't know named Daniel Danson. And I read this and I thought, oh my God, you can do this as a job? Someone will pay you to do this as a job? And I was off. It was like, that was it. This is what I want to do for my life. I don't think my undergraduate professors appreciated it very much when I tried to channel Janssen's style into my papers, but it was totally my start in the ASN. So I started off doing plant reproductive biology in college and then in graduate school, thinking about interactions between animals and plants from the plant perspective. I then moved into thinking about interactions between plants and animals from both perspectives. The effect of plants on animals, animals on plants. That got me into thinking much more about mutualism and about coevolution. And Butch is exactly right. There was no field of the study of mutualism at that point. It was a bunch of individual people doing individual things. There was no field of study that we can recognize now. And honestly, I spent my entire career trying to build that, trying to figure out what would be the conceptual foundations of this field. What are the big questions that we want to know that cut way across study systems, ecology, evolution, dynamics, natural history, and so on. And that's kind of where I've been for my career. So in this classic view of the interaction grid, where we polarize all the interaction types, my career really has, to the eyes of most people, has sat solidly in that little square called mutualism, right? I've studied a lot of questions. I've used a lot of tools ranging from theory to empirical, experimental, field, kind of everything. Studied a number of systems, but everything's arguably been right inside that little square. Because of that, some people think of me as extremely narrow. I only study mutualism. Other people say, oh, you're so broad because you're studying a million questions. It's kind of, two sides of the same coin. But the more and more in recent years, I've been thinking about this grid a lot and thinking about whether that block there really circumscribes my work and my thinking. And from there, it's sort of taken me, to the question of, does that block circumscribe anybody's work who's studying mutualism? Does it really fit inside that little square? And of course, from there, you start thinking more broadly, well, does anybody's work on any of these interactions fit inside those little named squares, right? It's just a fact. The human mind likes grids. We tend to build typologies and try to cram the immense diversity of our lives and everything we see in nature into named units. And so in this form, which you will find in ecology textbooks, for instance, or just as a subconscious bias, when we give a name to the interaction we're studying, it influences our science. And that's one of my major point today, is that typologies, even though we laugh about them not being real, they influence the way that we think. We know that all the blank space on these figures, the space in between all the named interactions, we know that it's not really blank, that there's all kind of phenomena out there, but we don't conversely pay it any special attention, right? We don't kind of do anything with it. And my argument today is simply going to be that this conscious or subconscious thinking about species interactions, or any other phenomena in our field, honestly, as a grid, as a typology, it impedes our understanding of nature, because we're telling stories that may not be the right stories. It impedes us from asking questions that don't occur to us, and it interferes with interpreting what sometimes is right smack in front of us. And at this point, you might be saying, yeah, right? It's like we all know that. We don't actually use the interaction grid. But I would say, actually, that whether we know it or not, it's very influential on our thinking. For one thing, if you look at textbooks, introductory textbooks, ecology textbooks, certainly, you will still see the picture of the grid, and different interactions are covered in different chapters in textbooks, often in rather different sections of the textbooks, right? Mutualism is not in the same chapter that competition and predation are. Secondly, meetings run interaction-specific sessions, right? This is very clear at the ecology meetings. It's also clear here. Take a look at the names of the sections and how topics are divided out. You gotta divide them out, and this is a way we do it. And then finally, the focal questions that we ask are often very different depending on which type of interaction our mind is at the time. I've spent a lot of the past few years thinking about what are, cumulatively the big questions we can ask about any mutualism. And, I've just listed them here. And as I look at these questions, they're really at least start from being mutualism specific. I don't want to imply that there's anything wrong with interaction specific research. A lot of questions, that's completely the appropriate way to study, okay? My point instead is that there's things we're missing. There's a lot of other really exciting research questions that might not occur to us because they fall in between these boxes. And the focal issues for one interaction are very likely to be relevant to others, and we just haven't thought very much about it. Today, I really want to focus on this first question, the other exciting questions we can ask when we realize how deceptive the interaction grid actually is. So I want to make 4 points, and I list them here, and I'm going to go through these one by one. Let me say, none of these are new to me. They are capturing what a lot of people, some of them at this meeting, some who have already presented here, are already starting to think about ways in which this interaction grid really dissolves when you look at it more deeply. The other thing is, I want to present a very big picture view. I will be presenting some stories from my research, but honestly, the fabulous work that goes down really deep into individual systems, that's not what I'm doing and what my lab is doing. It's what the community is doing. There is amazing work that is being done on all these questions. I wish I could give it the recognition in this talk that it deserves. By necessity, I'm going to focus on my own work in illustrating some of these points. So my first point is this. It's that interactions can map to more than one place on the grid. Now, as I do this, I'm going to look at the grid and sort of have an indication of what's wrong with the grid. Here, the problem with the grid is that the same interaction wants to be in two places at the same time. And a fabulous example of this is the interaction that I've been studying for a number of years in my lab with lots and lots of collaborators between jimsonweed, Datura wrightii, and the tobacco hornworm, Manduca sexta. Why does this fit in this part of the talk? It's because this is both a pollination and a plant herbivore interaction. The adults are pretty much the obligate pollinators of this plant, but the females, when they nectar and pollinate the plant, flip their abdomen around and lay eggs on the plant, and the caterpillars proceed to eat the plant up. So it wouldn't make sense to consider this just a plant pollinator interaction. You'd be missing the antagonism part of it. And it wouldn't be right to think of it only as a plant herbivore interaction, because you'd be missing the benefit that the plant is getting out of the herbivore. So you've got to take its dual nature into account. Now, there's just two brief points I want to focus on to show you why you've got to think this way about an interaction like this. So the first question is, in order to get pollinated, does Datura have to pay that price? Is there any way you can get the moth to pollinate you and then they fly off somewhere else and lay eggs, so some other plant bears the cost of herbivory? And the answer is pretty much no, that the plant is stuck with the cost of herbivory. Now, we know more and more from other groups about the neurobiological basis of this linkage. But let me just tell you a little bit of the ecology that you can see from standing out in the field and watching this interactions. First of all, 3/4 of the egg-laying visits of these female moths are done to plants that have a flower on them. If you don't have a flower, you don't reproduce, but you also aren't losing your leaves. Second of all, the moth is more likely to do both these activities, to nectar and oviposit, than to do only one of them. Now, of course, interestingly, the males are only pollinating, but the problem is with the females. And that is a very tight behavioral linkage. The act of nectaring makes them want to lay an egg. And then third, the more flowers a female moth visits, the more eggs she lays. Okay? So it's a cost the plants seem to be stuck with. And that's why you can't think about the quality of pollination without taking herbivory into account. But then, we have to ask the question, how bad a cost is that? How bad is it, as you see in this photo, how bad is it to be eaten up by your obligate pollinator? Sounds pretty bad. And we've done a lot of experiments to try to figure that out. Experiments in which we plant a ton of plants of known genetic background. We allow them to be cut before or after our monsoon season, cut lightly, cut heavily, mimicking the activity of the moth. And the answer is really clear, which is that the cost of herbivory is shockingly low in these plants. When we do simulated herbivory, there's basically no effect on growth and reproduction in these plants. You cut them, they grow right back. By the end of the season, they've produced the same number of flowers, same number of fruits, same number of seeds. And that's true even if you take it out a few years and look to see if there's, effects that might appear in a later year. It's just not that costly to be consumed by your obligate pollinator. And clearly, there is some fascinating evolution that must have gone on, right, into either the interaction is only possible in the face of a very low cost of herbivory, or a low cost of herbivory evolving after the mutualism started. And I'll get back to that. So there's a million open questions. And these are open questions not only about this system, but about any system that doesn't want to be in one square on the grid. Which comes first? If there's two kinds of interactions that an interaction embodies, in this case, did mutualism come first? Did antagonism come first? Can a link like this only evolve when the cost of antagonism is very low? Can selection act to lower the cost of antagonism? Can selection break that link entirely, such that an interaction might start out as both beneficial and costly, but over evolutionary time, it goes to straight benefit? We don't know the answer to these questions, but there's a lot of interesting work to be done. In asking the next big question, I'm going to get back to this issue, what comes first in this interaction, mutualism or antagonism. And this relates to my second big point, which is that interaction outcomes, where on the grid an interaction fits, can shift over evolutionary time. Now, this is very, very well known in evolutionary biology, that interactions move across this grid. We have lots of wonderful examples. In fact, really the #1 question that is asked about mutualism evolution is, what's the risk of the temptation to cheat? What's the risk that mutualism will break down to antagonism? And how can partners keep each other honest and keep them from being beneficial? So this is a huge topic. But it's still one that we don't have general answers to. We know that interactions shift around the grid, but we don't know very much about when that happens, how it happens, and when it doesn't happen, okay? So there's a lot of generality in this topic that we still don't know the answer to. And I want to get back and, as the vignette to illustrate this question, go back to my Manduka-Datura interaction. Because in this case, there's good evidence that rather than a mutualism breaking down to antagonism, what we have in this case is an interaction that was initially antagonistic, initially a plant-herbivore interaction, and then that herbivore was co-opted as a pollinator, as a mutualist. And we have a lot of layers of evidence of this, but I'd like to highlight here a theoretical paper that my postdoc, Chris Johnson, spearheaded last year in Nature Communications, which is a very heavily parameterized with field data eco-coevolutionary model that looked at this question. And we developed what's called the co-opted antagonist hypothesis. And basically what the modeling shows is that you start with an antagonist, and then in this case, a plant herbivore interaction. So you co-opt an herbivore, and it's co-opted to perform a beneficial function. And then subsequently, there's a suite of phenotypic traits that evolve that turn that interaction into a mutualism, the point when the benefits outweigh the costs. And certainly one of those phenotypic traits that evolves is the evolution of tolerance to the damage that herbivore inflicts. Now, the question here is, we can model this kind of process, but do the models have to be system specific? If we do the co-opted antagonist hypothesis, and it is a great way of capturing this particular interaction, does it have any generality to any other kind of interaction? Maybe, for instance, it's good for understanding yuccas and yucca moths. Another case where you have an insect that's both a pollinator and a destroyer of tissue. But is it good for understanding plant rhizobium interactions, plant mycorrhizal interactions, or do we need completely different kinds of models for that? Jury's still out, need more work. The third point, interaction outcomes can vary in ecological time. Previously, I was talking about evolutionary time. It also varies in ecological time and space. Now, you go to the ecology meetings, huge numbers of talks about mutualism are all about context dependency, or the idea that interactions have different outcomes based on the different environments they occurred in. That's one phenomenon that falls within this category. There's many others. And variable outcomes of the same interaction are everywhere in nature. There's no doubt about it. Here's an example, and I'm going to be building on this example, which has to do with the behavior of floral visitors when they come up to flowers on a plant. Insects, hummingbirds do this, is often there's multiple ways that an animal can interact with a flower, and some of them are beneficial and some of them are costly. And here I'm showing 3 different kinds of behaviors. We have bees that are visiting these flowers. This is manzanita in southern Arizona. They're visiting them as pollinators. But some of them can also make a hole through the side of the flower and get the nectar very quickly out that way. That does not transfer pollen. So it's either neutral or antagonistic, negative, depending on a variety of factors. So they can make a hole, not pollinate. And then the third possibility, they might not make a hole themselves, but they can use someone else's hole. And in theory, any forager can go back and forth among at least two of these three options, okay? Only one of which is mutualistic, and the other two aren't. Well, I've been doing a lot of work on this in Colorado near the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab with my collaborators Becky Irwin at NC State and Eleanor Lichtenberg at North Texas University. And we've been looking at a whole community of plants out there, all with tubular flowers visited by a large community of bumblebees. And what we find is that most of the bumblebees on most of the plants, when they visit, are doing more than one thing at the level of species. So for instance, we have, can't read this, Bombus mixtus, when it's visiting a plant called Corydalus, that's here, is both pollinating, mutualistic, and nectar robbing, antagonistic. Bombus mixtus visiting bluebells can do all three behaviors. Bombus bifarius visiting linaria, butter and eggs, can do two behaviors. In only one case, one bee on the bluebell is only doing one of the behaviors. So at the species level, you're seeing different individuals either being cooperators, mutualists, or non-cooperators, either commensals or antagonists. That's at the species level. Now, it's very different if you look at the individual level, and I think this is really interesting. Once an individual decides what it's going to do, it tends to stick with that behavior. So we can mark bees and then follow them for a day around the field. And a bee that's nectar robbing will continue to nectar rob again and again and again. Okay? One that's pollinating will do it again and again and again. We don't yet know what sets a bee on one behavior or the other. At the species level, we know that they can do both things. It's an unsolved problem. Okay? So what's going on? Well, the bees have a very complex foraging task, and there's kind of two things they could maximize. They could maximize or minimize searching and handling costs, just keep doing the same thing on the same plant you're doing, or they could explore alternatives. And the fact that these bees that we're studying keep doing the same thing again and again suggests that what they're doing is prioritizing the reduction in searching and handling costs and not maximizing their opportunities to explore alternatives. We've done a lot of experiments to quantify the foraging efficiency of the different foraging strategies that the different bees have in front of them, and it's very consistent with that story. Okay, so there's good news for the plants in this, which is that if a bee decides it's a mutualist, it doesn't seem to have much of a temptation to cheat. It just keeps pollinating and pollinating and pollinating, and the plant doesn't have to have sanctions to make it do that. It's in the foraging advantage of that bee to do that. Now, the downside of that is once they start doing antagonistic behaviors, they want to persist with that. And this is really remarkable. It may be hard for you to see here, but when a bee has it in her mind that she chews holes through flowers, she will go to a flower and chew a second hole, a third hole, a fourth hole, rather than use someone else's hole or rather than switch to foraging in a different way. It's like she doesn't look to see if there's another hole. It's like, I'm a hole feeder, and that's what I'm going to do. Okay? It's a very interesting consistency. Now, that's not to say that individuals never switch between mutualism and antagonism. We know that they do, and our current work is devoted to try to figure out who is doing these switchings and why are they doing those. Okay? So the big open general questions about this, well, under what ecological situations will these shifts in outcome occur? And then what I think is a really shockingly open question is what are the evolutionary consequences of such shifts for the persistence of species and also for trait evolution? Context dependency is everywhere, not only in mutualism, but in other kinds of interactions. You change the environment a bit, you change the outcome of the interaction. Does our body of evolutionary theory about species interactions take that into account? Negligibly. And I've been waiting for 30 years for someone to jump into this, and it's still, I think, an open question. Okay, my final point is that interactions interact with each other, okay? And of course, that's the point at which individual interactions start scaling up to communities. We know that different communities have different interactions, but we have not thought a great deal about how the different interactions interact with each other. If you think about classic views of ecological networks, those are bipartite, okay? There are many players in those networks, but there is one kind of interaction, for instance, plants and pollinators. We have to move to a multi-layer network, which people are now starting to do, to start seeing how different interactions interact with each other. So how do interactions interact? I want to kind of make 3 points about how this can happen. The first is that in some cases, the outcome of an individual kind of interaction is dependent on a second interaction. Well, what do I mean? The best example I can give you is the example of protection mutualisms. In protection mutualisms, and I've shown 3 of them here, you have one partner who is protecting another species in return for some reward. It's protecting them from enemies. Okay, so here on the left panel, you have ants protecting aphids from a ladybug predator. In the center, you have an oxpecker bird that is picking ectoparasites off the back of a zebra, and so it's cleaning the mammal. And in the last panel, you have ants and acacias. The ants are protecting the acacias from herbivores. Well, why are these mutualisms? There's mutualisms because there is a predator-prey interaction possible. There is an enemy, and the defender species, the ants on 2 of these examples, the bird in the center example, that the protector is dealing with that enemy. And that is why that interaction is a mutualism. So what happens if you don't have that interaction? What if the enemy isn't there? Well, there's 2 possibilities. One is the interaction can shift to commensalism, a +0 interaction. That would be the case if having a protector around is not beneficial, it's not costly, they're just kind of around. Okay, so to my knowledge, and let me know if I'm wrong, I think that the ants on acacias, if there's no herbivores present, they aren't, in the short term, any kind of cost for the plant. And they're a reserve force when herbivores show up. So at that point, the ants aren't doing anything good or bad for the plant. Okay, so it would shift to a commensalism. But of course, there's another possibility, which is that if there's any cost of the interaction, if there's any cost of that defender, then in the absence of the enemy, its cost might exceed the benefit. And this is exemplified in a nice, gory way by that center example of oxpeckers. Okay, so these are birds that clean ectoparasites, like blood-engorged ticks, off the back of many African wildlife and also livestock. And it turns out that once they're done feeding on these blood-engorged insects, what do? They're blood feeders. So they enlarge the wound and they continue to feed on the blood at the cost, at a demonstrable cost to these animals. In fact, African ranchers do not consider these birds to be mutualists. Their local name is vampire birds. And their goal is to get rid of them. They see them as antagonists, okay? Because in the absence of what they can protect against, they are doing harm, okay? So here in one kind of mutualism, interaction, you can range from mutualism to commensalism to antagonism very easily. So that's the first way that interactions can interact with interactions. The second way I would highlight is that sometimes there are 2 interactions going on that have a shared partner. And those interactions can interact either additively, synergistically, or antagonistically. This is a case of mistletoe. that was worked out by my great graduate student, Kelsey Yule. This is a case in which you have a plant that has a mutualism with pollinators and a mutualism with seed dispersers. Actually, it's one of the only systems I know where there's a single seed disperser. It's a bird, the phainopepla. This is in southern Arizona. Okay, so you have a plant that has two mutualisms going on. And the question is, do those two mutualisms interact? And they do. They do. And the reason is that phainopepla eat the pollinators. Okay, so you have an interesting case where the plant needs both, but one mutualist is eating the other. And Kelsey, in collaboration with Chris Johnson, who I mentioned before, have done some really interesting, exciting modeling, looking at the population dynamics of how interactions between interactions can function with that. The other brief vignette I want to give you about theory is a paper that just appeared 2 days ago. It's with Sarah McPeak and Mark McPeak. So this is a very ASN collaboration. And it involves a little network in which you have a shared partner. Once again, let's imagine it's a plant that interacts with mutualists and interacts with antagonists. And in particular here, we're thinking about a plant that interacts with pollinators and interacts with herbivores. And this is an eco-evolutionary model, and it looks at the evolution of nectar production in light of the cost of herbivory to the plant. And it just came out. Big shout out to Sarah, one of our members of our ASN Graduate Council, for really spearheading a fabulous piece of theory on this. So that's the second way, is these synergistic or antagonistic interactions between interactions. The third kind of interactions between interactions is this. It's the idea that in an apparently two-partner interaction, unless it's completely specialized, like unless it's the figs and fig wasps that I started with and kind of not even then, there's generally multiple partners on at least one side. And they're having their own dynamics. They're interacting as a guild. And those interactions, for instance, their competitive interactions, can affect the net interaction with the shared partner. And there's some nice theory, once again, by Chris Johnson, who I have in this photo here, in ecology, looking at this general problem and what kind of dynamics result. But I want to give you an example that subsumes all of these three ways that interactions would interact. And this is my third example of my system. And it involves barrel cactus that are local to my beloved home in the Sonoran Desert, and the ants that defend it from herbivores and the pollinators that pollinate it. This is with a number of collaborators. Particular shout out to Bill Morris of Duke University, who really drove much of this research. Now, what I want to focus on here is the interaction between these two mutualisms, once again, between the plant pollinator interactions and the protection mutualism, and then also look at how competitive dynamics among the ants end up affecting the protection interaction. So these are just some pictures of the major ants we have at our main study site, Tumamoc Hill, right in the middle of Tucson. And we've studied these ants in great depth over the years. And they differ. They differ in two really critical ways. They're all native desert ants. They differ, first of all, in their quality of defense. We can give them a standard task of clearing herbivores off the plants, and we can see how they do. So we know how they rank. And they differ in how they affect pollinators when they happen to encounter one. Okay? And in particular, with regard to that, I want to polarize two of the most common of these ants, Solenopsis xylani, which is a native fire ant, and Chromatogaster opuntiae. Solenopsis xylani is a fierce, nasty ant. And it's fabulous at clearing herbivores off the plant. Takes very few ants, very little time to do the standardized task of getting rid of all the herbivores. The problem with Solenopsis is It wanders into flowers all the time, and it attacks bees. It attacks the bee pollinators. And I'm sure you can't see this, but this is a pinned bee. We were identifying the bees, and we found a head of Solenopsis clamped on the leg of that ant. I mean, they attack them, and bees avoid the flowers as a consequence. And this does take a toll in the fruit production success. On top of that, sort of to add insult to injury, they go in the flowers and they snip the anthers and they take them down to their nest and eat them. So this is an ant, gives you great defense, and it messes with pollination, okay? High benefit ant, high cost ant. Meanwhile, you have Chromatogaster. Chromatogaster, you know, it's okay at defense. Takes a lot more workers, a lot of time to clear the plant, but eventually the herbivores are gone. Chromatogaster will not go in the flowers. It's repelled by the odors, so it leaves pollination entirely alone, okay? Low benefit, low cost ant. So which mutualist do you want? Do you want the first one? Do you want the second one? You can only answer that from studying both interactions and by thinking about what is more limiting to the plant at a given moment. Is it the herbivores are limiting success, or pollinators? In a world or in a setting or in an individual spot, place in space where herbivore attack is extremely heavy, as in this case where herbivores are just demolishing the flowers, it's much better to have the super fierce ant. These are long-lived perennials. They can probably pass up a little bit of reproduction, and there's no way you're going to reproduce anyway with the ants doing that to your flowers. I mean, with the herbivores doing that to your flowers. In that world, you want Solenopsis. But in a world where herbivores are very few, and let's be honest, there's not that much that can eat a barrel cactus. There are things, but not a lot. And a world in which pollinators can be kind of limiting, Chromatogaster is a much better choice. So you can't answer the question of who's the best ant defender without thinking about what's going on with the other interaction. Now, my second point there was the competitive dynamics. Now, there would be competitive dynamics among the different bee pollinators. There's several species there. There would be competitive dynamics among the different plants at any Sonoran Desert site that also have extrafloral nectaries and are competing for ants. But I want to focus on the competitive dynamics among the ants because that's really what we've studied. And we know a lot about which ants kick the butts of which ants. We've done a lot of standardized trials here. And there's a very, very clear hierarchy. With Solenopsis eilani, our super fierce protector against herbivores, being the most competitive ant. And that's pretty typical. It's not a surprise that the best at kicking off herbivores is also the best at kicking other ants off the plants. And Solenopsis, you'll notice, is Chromatogaster is third down. Well, we can put then what we know about mutualistic quality. And remember that this is context dependent. It matters what's going on with the strength of the frequency of pollination and also herbivory, so that we can't draw an arrow of who's the best mutualist and who's the worst mutualist, because it depends. Well, what this means is you can't necessarily, as a plant, get the ant you want, right? Remember, we said Chromatogaster is the ant you would want if you're not having that much herbivory and pollinators are really limiting. That's the ant you want. But given this competitive hierarchy, you can't necessarily get it, because you're more likely to get the super competitive ant. So you're going to be stuck with Solenopsis regardless, right? Even though Chromatogaster would be the better mutualist. And you can only think about that by remembering that there's competition going on at the same time that there's mutualism, okay? Now that's especially true that you can't get the defender you want in a warming world. Now, I haven't said anything about climate change, right? But I'm an ecologist. It's always about climate change. These days, it's always about climate change. And it turns out that this story, too, is about climate change. And the reason is, and this is well known among people who study ants, is that there's a negative relationship between thermal tolerance and competitive dominance. In other words, the most competitively dominant ant has a very narrow thermal tolerance. As soon as it gets hot in the Sonoran Desert, which is like 8 a.m., right? Solenopsis is out of there. It's too hot. Meanwhile, Forelius, which is absolutely the bottom of the pack in terms of competitive dominance, is out there very, very happily, okay? So what's going to happen as the world warms up? Well, let me now say that Forelius is not only competitively inferior, it's a terrible defender of this plant. Basically, it sees an herbivore and it runs from danger. It does not help the plant, okay? But it can be out there on a hot day. And the days where I live, not surprisingly, are getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So in a warming world, that is the ant that we're going to be left with, and that has really implications for the long-term persistence of mutualism. So, you know, what I've been doing here is giving you a bunch of vignettes from my study systems and giving you an idea of the multiple tools we use while trying to get at these bigger issues about species interactions. And let me just highlight again my key message from each of these 4 points. With regard to the question about interactions that can only be considered as being in more than one place at the same time, well, we need to know if these interaction components are evolving independently or are somehow evolving jointly, and how they come and go as interactions evolve. I think that's a really exciting challenge for the future, both empirically and theoretically. The second point, interaction outcomes can shift over evolutionary time. We have, in the last 25 years, beautiful examples from many, many kinds of interactions that this goes on. Our understanding still is very deep about individual systems and not yet broad to understand what the general principles are of when interactions will and won't break down. A lot of work, exciting work going on this, and we need much more. My third point, interaction outcomes can vary in ecological time and space. We have been telling stories about this as ecologists for many, many years, but we still have very little idea about how these variable outcomes influence the ecology and evolution of interactions as a whole, and I think this is really important to pursue. And then finally, this question of interactions between interactions, we're just beginning to study how different kinds of interactions interact. And I think this is a real growth area in the field. So, you know, my point has been that these research directions, which have been developing, they're not captured by this interaction grid, because they all involve in one place or another multiple squares at the same time, or else all that space in between the squares, okay? So again, it's kept us, this kind of grid typological thinking has kept us from understanding nature, from asking new questions, from interpreting what we learn. And I do think, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I think this idea has been very constraining to us, our desire to find typologies. So, you know, it's a legitimate question. Can we visualize what the world of all these interactions would look like in a non-polarized way, if we dissolved all these boundaries and saw everything as a giant schmear? And I actually do. I think it's quite possible to envision interactions this way. This is the idea of the interaction continuum, okay? And if you look at this continuum, the basic idea is that there's a center point, which is the absence of an interaction. It's a 0, 0 point. As you move out on any axis, you get stronger and stronger pluses and minuses. And then as you move around, you shift pluses to zeros to minuses and so on. So everything ends up as a compass. Now, this is not original with me. It was actually first proposed in the 1950s by a guy named Edward Haskell. He was a sociologist, the same guy who invented the interaction grid. He was actually doing it in order to understand all the different ways that humans interacted with each other. And then he abandoned the grid because he said, it's not a typology, it's a continuum. But nobody did anything with it. And I think this is really exciting because I think you can do things with it. I think you can start seeing interactions as in dynamic space. You can start mapping interactions. You could start taking real data and mapping it and looking at where the clouds of an individual interaction occur and how it changes over time. So here's just 3 ways you might choose to map interactions. In green, we have an interaction that would map to 2 different places, right? My Datura Manduka example is like that. Depending on the life history stage, it's a mutualism or it's a plant-herbivore interaction. Or for that matter, it's those bees that can either pollinate or nectar rob, very distinct behaviors with potentially very distinct consequences for the plants. So that's in green. In pink, you have an interaction that stays at a given interaction type. In this case, it stays as competition. But it varies depending on ecological conditions or over evolutionary time from a strong interaction to a weak interaction. And then the other thing is to imagine trajectories, to imagine vectors moving across the space. And so I've shown one in blue. And so that would be either from over ecological space, over ecological time, or over evolutionary time. So I think we could take interactions and start to map them in this space. And that would be a way of getting away from this thinking. Hasn't started yet, but I think it's possible to imagine this. Okay, so just to close, this has been my trajectory, as I've said, in the study of species interactions. For a number of years now, I've been working on this conceptual foundations for the study of mutualism, and it's time for me to move on. And this is where I'm going. I'm going to get out of that box. I'm getting out of my mutualism box and starting to think about how all interactions blend into each other and how we can further the understanding of mutualism and all interactions by adopting that perspective. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and if we have time, I'll take a few questions. Okay.
So more a comment than a question. It occurs to me that, for example, you can reconceive that. So, for example, we have no problem in the notion that within an individual, we put resources into growth versus resources into reproduction. But that's what the Datura is doing, right? It's putting resources, taking it away from growth, putting it into reproduction, except it's just doing it through an external animal.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting way to see it. Now, we don't find, it's very hard in the field to find trade-offs between growth and reproduction. But you're absolutely true that in some ways, you're outsourcing your needs to another species. And that's a great way, actually, for thinking about all mutualisms and how they work, is what activities and what commodities you're outsourcing to another species. And that's a great way, of course, of generalizing across interactions. And there's a great and growing body of theory that just views mutualisms as consumer resource interactions, right? And it's a very profitable way that I haven't been able to touch on of reframing interactions. If you start thinking about consumer resource interactions, then most mutualisms fall into that. It's just cases in which the consumer is providing a residual benefit as well as consuming the resource. So great, thanks. Does anyone have a microphone by any chance? Okay, well, just yell, and if you can momentarily take off your mask, I would appreciate it.
So I was thinking the first example to add more complexity to it. I could say the females are laying eggs in this plant, and if for some reason that were to change, the reward
Yeah, I couldn't hear all of what you were saying, but I think one thing you're getting at is this very interesting difference of who really are the mutualists. Are the mutualists the male moths or the female moths? The female moths are inflicting a cost. They're laying eggs. Whether that's a big cost or a small cost, we've been getting at. But what about males? Why not just attract males, right? The only thing they do is nectar. And they may be the true mutualists in the situation. And we're actually setting up some experiments to see if there are odors of the flowers that can differentially attract males, so that the males would, there are floral odors that might foster attraction of the males in particular, and shift that balance, which I think would be really cool. Someone else? Mm-hmm.
I have sort of two questions. I hope it's okay. The first is, do the bees that shift behaviors always shift from one particular behavior to another, or can they shift from any behavior to any other behavior? And the second question is, what are the close relatives of the datura have as their pollinators? Yeah.
Both great questions. Okay, with regard to these multiple strategies of the bees, there are definitely, it's very rare to have a bee that does all three of these things: pollinate, make a hole, use someone else's hole. The first combination you see is in bees that cannot make a hole. Honeybees don't have chewing mouth parts. They cannot be primary robbers. They love using other individuals' holes. So they will combine pollination with secondary robbing. When do they do it? They will only start secondary robbing once there's enough primary robbing holes in the flowers. So it's facilitated by another species. If there's no insects there that are making holes, honeybees will stay mutualistic. If not, you get to a threshold of holes in the community, and the honeybees will all promptly switch and be robbers. Pollinators are also sometimes primary robbers. So they will pollinate or they will make holes. What you don't see is primary robbers who will use the holes that other individuals have made. And I'd love to know why. That's when you get this weird phenomenon of, I'd rather make my own hole than use yours. Thank you very much. And I don't know what causes that. So there are combinations that you're more likely to see. Now, for instance, we have bee species that do 3/4 of one behavior as a population and 1/4 of the other. We give them standardized tests in the lab to look at the foraging efficiency of using each of those behaviors. And what we find is the behavior that they can get the nectar out fastest and the most nectar out in the lab is the behavior we see most commonly in the field. The second best strategy is the one we see rarely in the field. The behavior that they're terrible with in the lab, you don't see in the field. So it makes sense on the basis of foraging strategy. With regard to your question about what the relatives of datura do, this is a project that's in the works. There's only about 15 species of datura, and there's a very, very well worked out phylogeny. There are datura that are pollinated and eaten by hawk moths like ours. There appear to be, and only 2 or 3 datura have ever been studied in the field, so we need to get accessions mostly from Mexico on this. There's datura that are pollinated by bees and eaten by hawk moths, and there's ones that are pollinated by hawk moths and evidently not, their eggs, they don't lay their eggs on them. So to get at these questions of what came first, absolutely this is the approach to go, and to compare these and to look, for instance, at the secondary chemistry. Now, an interesting point here, if you know anything about datura, you know that it's a really incredible hallucinogen. It has very powerful alkaloids that have extremely strong effects on vertebrates. And so the plant maintains these very, very high alkaloid levels. These hawk moths, these pollinators, they have absolutely no effect. They go in one end and they come out the other end. And they are the major herbivores of the plant. But clearly, other kinds of herbivores are still important enough in these plants that the plants have retained very, very heavy secondary defense to protect against them. And I think there's some interesting stuff to be worked out there. It's a great example of why you can't stop with thinking of this as a Datura-Manduka interaction. You have to take into account other herbivores, or the presence of the secondary chemistry just makes no sense at all. So thanks. David?
So with regards to the continuum of interactions that you show, where everything's a way around, in interpreting that and thinking about evolutionary transitions between types of interactions, do you think it's correct to suggest that this continuum proposes that, say if you have a shift from one interaction to another one, it has to pass through the other types that it crosses around the rim of that diagram? So for instance, if you have a mutualism to an antagonism transition, does it have to pass through commensalism? If you have a predation to competition transition, does it have to pass through antagonism?
This is a great question. So it's a constraint of the interaction continuum, is that there's always, it's not a perfect picture. It's still a two-dimensional vision of interactions. So David's point is that, can you get, for instance, from mutualism to predation by some kind of jump, over ecological or evolutionary time that does not go through commensalism? Could you just take a giant jump there? I think you must be able to. I think we don't know. I've thought about this continuum the most with relation to the least studied of all interactions, which is commensalism, and thinking about what the heck is commensalism, and where does commensalism come from, and where does it go? And one possibility, given, so commensalism is +0, is that it's an interaction that's on the way to mutualism or on the way to antagonism. But there's many other ways that commensalism can appear. It can totally appear by a jump. And I don't yet know how you could really, and those of you who think in graphical terms, I don't want to make this an insanely complicated four-dimensional figure, but it's not going to be able to capture things like that. But even by asking that question, I think we've made some progress. We might not be able to visualize it, but we've made progress by asking the question. How are we doing? Okay, maybe a couple of questions back there. You're gonna, if you can, like, walk around and.
Yeah. So with regards to the population level variability in eating strategy, I'm wondering if you know about any genetic determinants of using different strategies. And I'm asking largely because it kind of reminds me of negative frequency dependence, maintaining those cooperators and cheaters in other contexts.
Right. This is a great question. So the general issue that I think you're getting at and that brings to mind is, so if you have at the population level in our bees, for instance, so bees want to keep doing what they're doing, but if you go out in a field and stand around and see the bees, different bees are doing 3 different things. Why? Well, there's at least 2 possibilities. One is they had some kind of formative event in their life. For instance, when they first emerged from the colony and did their first foraging bouts, and maybe they experimented and settled on one of them. The other possibility is that they're genetically different. We know that they don't differ in size. That was my first guess, is that some of these bees aren't pollinators because their tongues aren't long enough to get down into those deep flowers. I thought, oh, it's the smaller individuals in these bees that are robbing. Well, first of all, there's almost no size variation. And second of all, no, there's no relation. So the other possibility is that these bees are from different colonies. So that you have colonies that are just nectar robbing and colonies that are just pollinating. We've collected the genetic material from many, many workers to genotype them, and we don't have the answer to that yet. And I'm really excited to find out what the answer might be. So great. So I would like to wrap up at this point and thank everyone very much. Remind you about what immediately follows in here is the ASN Vice Presidential Symposium, which is going to run for much of the day. We're all really excited about. In between, after lunch, but before we resume that symposium, we have our members meeting that I strongly encourage you to come and hear about what's going on in the society and a few other issues that we'd like to talk about, and get your questions about what we've been up to and some changes we've made that you might notice. And then once again, greatly look forward to seeing many of you at Asilomar next January for the ASN standalone meeting. And thanks very much for coming out at this hour.